Is caloric restriction for increasing lifespan total hogwash? Like, does it really matter? And if it does matter, do you have to be eating a bad diet for it to really matter? Like, should we just eat whole foods and we should focus on nutrient quality because does it all fall into place? Well, there's evidence that breaks this down for us. And it's not as simple and cut and dry as you might think. In fact, as we get towards the end of this video, you'll have sort of a playbook as to how to craft it for yourself, but also a little trick that you can utilize to get the most out of it. The study that we have to look at is one that was published in Nature, and it is one of the most famous studies in the world of caloric restriction because it was a 23-year-long study that looked at monkeys. Now, monkeys, this is about as good as you can get when you're looking at like full metabolic studies that are close to humans that are looking at longevity. You can't look at fruit flies, you can't always look at mice, okay? That has a powerful, powerful role, but monkeys it's gonna be a lot stronger evidence when you're looking at these lifespan studies. What they did is they had monkeys restrict calories by 30%, but they did this in 3 separate groups. They did it in juvenile monkeys that were young, they did it in adult monkeys, and then they did it in older monkeys. So they restricted calories at different stages of life. And what they found is that when they restricted calories by 30% in older monkeys, it didn't increase their lifespan. It didn't do anything. So starting to restrict calories late in life might not really help you at all. However, what they did find is it did improve some metabolic markers like their triglycerides and their mitochondrial health. So maybe they got more health span. Maybe they felt better as they were older. That's important. But here's where it gets wild. Young monkeys that were calorically restricted did not see much change in their lifespan either. So even when they started caloric restriction at a young age, it didn't really improve their lifespan. Now, it didn't really improve their metabolic markers all that much when they were young too, and that's probably just because they were young. So it's like caloric restriction when you're older will improve possibly your health span and how you feel, but caloric restriction when you're younger may not even be that worth it based on this. Don't worry, we'll unpack this more. Probably because your cells are young and everything's resilient. But there was a very clear difference between this study and all these other studies that clearly show that caloric restriction is good for longevity, right? Like, caloric restriction shows countless merit when it comes down to longevity, but not with this study. But what is different about this one? This particular study used natural ingredients that mimicked what the monkeys would realistically be eating in the wild. They used a naturally based diet compared to the other monkey study that showed that caloric restriction did work for longevity. Those monkeys ate a purified diet, which was very isolated, singular nutrients, and it was basically monkey chow. It was basically processed food compared to whole foods. The fat profile that they gave these monkeys in this study was totally different. They gave them fat derived from fish, derived from wheat, derived from soy, from corn. I know we don't like all of those fats, in the human diet, and I know there's different opinions here. Bottom line is they gave them a wide spectrum of naturally occurring fats compared to just corn oil in some of these other studies. So it was a much more naturally mimicking diet. They ate about 60% carbs in this monkey study. And you know what? A lot of the other monkey studies, and the one other one that showed caloric restriction does work, also gave them 60%. You know what was different? This study gave them a wide variety of carbohydrates. Gave them wheat, gave them corn, gave them some fruit. The other study gave them cornstarch and sugar. Now, we have to get to an important piece here, which is the protein, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But let me recap what's very important to drive home here. Caloric restriction worked when the diet was bad. Caloric restriction didn't do a whole lot other than some metabolic improvement when the diet was good. That's pretty powerful to say. Now, one of the pieces they looked at was protein. The protein was very different. In this study, they gave a wide variety of proteins, a lot of different amino acids, okay? So they gave them, obviously, some fish. They gave them what a monkey would eat, maybe a little bit of fish, maybe some protein coming from wheat, some this, and that. They tried to mimic as much as they could, okay? The other studies were singular sources of protein. Again, we're talking monkey chow. It could have been just soy protein for all we know, right? It's just, so the quality of the protein seems to matter. And there's so much weird evidence out there that tries to say that meat is the problem because of, like, say, saturated fat and whatnot. But unfortunately, what they're doing is they're roping processed meat into that group. Whole food, real protein is good, but when it's processed, like we see in these other caloric restriction studies, it could be problematic. Now, a quick pause to thank our video sponsor, ButcherBox. If you like good quality meat, that link down below is going to get you grass-fed, grass-finished beef. So if you're trying to increase the quality of the meat that you're consuming, I highly, highly recommend them. Now, right now, they're offering some pretty cool stuff. They have all beef hot dogs. They also have the traditional steaks that you would think of, like the ribeyes, the New Yorks, and all of that. But they also have some pretty cool things down the pipe too. They have some chicken tenders. They have some gluten-free chicken nuggets. If you've got kids, you're looking for a little bit of a better option there than traditional chicken nuggets. But they have a wide variety of different things that they're expanding on. Not to mention they have fish, not to mention they have scallops. They have all kinds of different options now. But the best thing is going to be the good old-fashioned ground beef or ground bison. That way you're getting the collagen, you're getting all the nutrients, because the collagen in its whole food form, like in a ground meat, hands down gonna be the best collagen you can get, at least in my opinion. So that is a special link down below where you can get the kind of things that I get from ButcherBox. You can see my custom choices, but you can also select whatever cuts you want, and then they get delivered to your doorstep. And oftentimes it's cheaper than going to the grocery store. Plus, you don't have to go to the grocery store. So a huge thank you to ButcherBox for the ongoing support. And a huge thank you to them for making this content possible. The best way you can support this channel is by getting good food in your house and using ButcherBox that helps support us as well. So that link is down below. Another wild thing that this study did is they used super supplementation, where they added 40% above the recommended daily allowance of particular vitamins. So they said, let's really give a lot of supplementation to make sure they're getting enough nutrition. Whereas the other studies just made sure they were getting the bare minimum, right? So it's evidence to suggest that going above and beyond actually has some potency. Like supplementation can work, especially when you're trying to get more of a good thing, but not too much. Now, let's break down the main problem that we face with longevity studies today. Most longevity studies are looking at stuff in isolation and not looking at real world. So you're not looking at whole foods coming into the diet, things that actually make sense in the real world. The other thing is most caloric restriction studies are looking at people that are already overweight or subjects that are already overweight. Of course, caloric restriction is going to increase the lifespan when a subject is already overweight because they're already in a bad cohort, not looking at a healthy cohort. So you're looking at someone that's unhealthy and then restricting calories. Certainly you're gonna see an improvement there because you're offsetting being obese, right? This study shows us that we have a lot to learn. So let's break down why a whole food diet could be so effective and how you can start changing your diet. Let's start with fruits and vegetables here. This may sound like kindergarten nutrition, but it's real. There was a study published in Circulation that looked at 66,000 women and 42,000 men and broke down into 26 trials. Okay, they found flat out that there is an inverse correlation between fruit and veggie consumption and all-cause mortality. And that is the kind of data we can't ignore. We could say correlation doesn't equal causation. People that eat vegetables and fruits are more likely to be active, yada, yada, yada. But when you're looking at these kinds of numbers, it makes you scratch your head and wonder if maybe you should eat a little bit more fruits and vegetables. But I'm a mechanistic guy. I like to look at that stuff. So what's going on? So with this, I've got some excerpts, some interesting studies, and some really profound statements from some esteemed researchers in these journals. Essentially what we're finding is that it's less about the carbohydrates or whatever that are in fruits and vegetables, because when you isolated for different carbohydrate load, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that people were getting the polyphenols and the antioxidants in. So here's an excerpt from a study published in the journal Antioxidants. Researchers said polyphenols are the most abundant antioxidant in the diet, and their intake is associated with reduced aging in humans. And then there's another section. Several studies collectively suggest that the intake of polyphenols and their major food sources may exert beneficial effects on insulin resistance and diabetes risk factors such as inflammation and oxidative stress. They flat out said that there is a strong correlation with reduced aging in humans based on polyphenol consumption. What does this mean? It means replace the processed junk with a kiwi or a watermelon or something else delicious that is polyphenol rich. You don't even have to load a big salad of vegetables. Eat the fruit. get the polyphenols because the antioxidants seem to be the answer, not so much the carbohydrate content. But now there's another piece. What about the fats, right? We sit here spending so much time getting concerned about red meat and saturated fat, or getting concerned about seed oils and this and that. Well, there was an interesting study published in the Journals of Gerontology, and this was fascinating. It was done in mice, but it was still really interesting what they found. They had mice restrict calories in 4 different groups. One group restricted calories 5%, another group restricted 40%, and 2 others restricted 40%. Out of all the 40% caloric restriction groups, they did different fats. One 40% group had soybean oil. The other 40% restriction group had fish oil. The other 40% restriction group had lard, which is a combination of saturated and monounsaturated fat. All of the 40% caloric restriction groups lived longer because they were calorically restricting and it made sense in this case. But the group that had the lard lived the longest. So 40% caloric restriction, but also consuming monounsaturated fats and saturated fats actually lived longer. That's not to say that fish oil is bad, but a diet made up predominantly of polyunsaturated fats is probably not good either. There's a common argument out there right now that is hotly debated, and that is that the level, your lifespan is dictated by the level of saturation or unsaturation. And what that means essentially is if you're eating too many polyunsaturated fats, it's not good for your body because you're like unstable, you're too fluid, the membranes are too fluid, not enough saturated hydrogen bonds. It makes sense, but no one's, well, actually there are people that are probably not consuming any saturated fat and only consuming polyunsaturated fats. I'm not even saying that you need to load up on saturated fats. Monounsaturated fats like olive oil and avocado are hugely beneficial because they're mostly saturated, but not fully saturated. So the combination of saturated and monounsaturated fats is huge. Maybe polyunsaturated fats are used ad hoc, sort of here and there, to help with membrane fluidity, but a diet made up solely of them is not good either. When you look at a lot of like mice chow in these longevity studies, it's predominantly polyunsaturated fats. My point in saying this is that, once again, where do you get these monounsaturated and saturated fats? They're not refined processed seed oils. They're from wholesome meat, wholesome fish, wholesome fruits and vegetables, things like avocado, things like nuts, like maybe you get a macadamia nut. You're gonna get some polyunsaturated, but you're also gonna get a lot of saturated and monounsaturated. Wholesome diet. Here's the kicker. You cannot talk about the benefits of meat without someone thinking that you're anti-fiber. And you can't talk about the benefits of fiber without someone thinking that you're plant-based anti-meat. Heck, I'm all about eating lots of meat, lots of fruit, and lots of fiber. Those are my big 3, meat, fruit, and fiber. And when you look at the literature with fiber, it's pretty hard to deny. The Archives of Internal Medicine published a paper, looked at 31,000 people and eventually their death, okay? What they found is that fiber was a huge factor in terms of their rate of death or their risk of death, right? The higher the intake of fiber, the less risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, from infectious disease, or from a respiratory disease. Okay, so, and that's just by increasing fiber intake. Now in men, it reduced their risk from 24 to 56%, and in women, it reduced their risk from 34 to 59%. So not a small reduction in risk, a monumental reduction in risk. Well, now we get to the big question here. How do we get the benefits of caloric restriction that we've seen in all this literature? David Sinclair, you name it. But how do we also get the wide spectrum of nutrition? How do we make sure we're getting enough? Well, with this, we look at an interesting study in mice. Those of you that know me know that I'm a big fan of this particular way of eating. So before you turn off this video and you think, oh gosh, here he goes. He's going to talk about fasting. I want you to really listen to this study. It doesn't mean you need to become an intermittent fasting diet fad freak, but you might want to hear this out. This study was published in the journal Cell Metabolism, and it looked at mice, but it was fascinating. They had mice go into 3 groups. A caloric restriction group where they ate 30% caloric restriction, restricted their calories by 30%. They had a control group that just ate ad libitum, ate as much as they want, free will. And they had a third group that would fast for 21 hours and then eat as much as they would want. Okay? What they found is that the fasting group and the caloric restriction group both had improvements to their lifespan. They lived longer. And there was a pretty decent improvement. What was wild was that the fasting group ate just as much as the control ad libitum group. So the fasting group ate a bunch of food. They ate way more than the caloric restriction group. They ate as much as the mice that were able to eat at will throughout the day, but they got all the benefits of caloric restriction without actually being calorically restricted. Now that happens because they were calorically restricted for part of the day, but then they just went into a time of the day where they weren't. So caloric restriction doesn't have to be consistent long caloric restriction. It can be concentrated caloric restriction, and then it can be a bolus of food. But you know what was cool? They were able to get the wide spectrum of nutrition that they needed by eating all that food in a shorter period of time. So the bottom line with this is eat a lot of whole foods and take periodic aggressive breaks, because caloric restriction does do things. But by just reducing your calories, you're potentially putting yourself at risk for not getting enough nutrition. And caloric restriction really seems to only have huge benefits if you're eating a crappy diet. So you might as well eat a lot of good food that's satiating, that's wholesome, that's nutritious, and then aggressively take breaks, fast and feast, fast and feast. And candidly, calories, although they matter on paper, they matter less in your body. I'll see you tomorrow.